Alrighty, so for week 8, we are going to do the wiring. How do we set up our code to handle the edit and delete? What are the things we need to put in place? Because as I really reflected upon the importance of what we need to make sure we're covering here, I decided after several rounds, matter of fact, I think we ended up with 4 different solutions in my using Gemini, because every time we did it, it felt like we weren't really focused on the parts I wanted to make sure we do have. And so in this case, right, we're going to render the interactive buttons, use the event delegation to detect clicks, but we're not handling the actual edit itself, and the delete will do that in week 9 code challenge. Okay? Okay, so in this case, you set it up from doing week 6, copying week 6 over, right? Update the title to wiring the dashboard. So in this case, and some of you may have done this, but make sure you have this, because that unique identifier that we need has to be, oh, and by the way, before I get there, and I'll just show you mine, it is way important at this point. I think one student ran into this, is that now because you have modified that local storage, you know, it is way important to come over here. Now, some of you actually coded in, and this is my output here, right, is that if I, submit here, that local storage is before you get started to come in here, right? Now, in this case, this deletes the selection. And if I refresh, I can tell that I'm back to no data. And it's way important to do that when you're actually changing the data inside of the local storage. Okay, so that's what this is talking about. And then refresh, it should be empty. So now what you're going to do here is I'm having you do it in stages like you've seen before. So this is, I want to reiterate something that I think I haven't been talking as much about, but how I grade this is actually it's really important that your commits show that you've actually done, like so on this one where you've added the unique ID. Now this one's not too bad because we're just updating. Now this is also where if you've given things different names, it can be a little bit challenging to figure out, okay, what are we doing here, right? So inside of our handle order submit, we're going to make sure we have that ID in there. Okay, so if you happen to name yours something different, you just have to know how to translate those things. So now what we're going to do is we're going to update that table. Now let me say here before we move on, I have scaled back in the challenges to not include all the functionality that we've built into the carbon footprint to really distill the ideas down to help us just make sure we understand that really important functionality of how to handle the edits. And in this case, we're delegating events, right? We're actually doing the edit and delete inside the app.js, but we're passing those functions as a reference into the order render, okay? So in this case, in the index, we have to, and I haven't given you specifics here, but we've done this, right? In the HTML, you find the head and then you add one for action. So ultimately what you end up with, and I'll just go ahead and place an order, right, is you have the actions. And this should look pretty familiar, right? The date, the quantity here, right? So in here, now again, we're not going to do this. All we're doing here is wiring everything up. Okay, and I'll show you what the output will look like in a minute. So now you're adding, right? So now you've added those. Now you're adding the buttons too. So this is adding the action to the HTML. And now what you're going to do is add those buttons into the table. Very much like what we did here, and in that case we're adding those TR, and you can look back at your carbon footprint to see how to do that. I will just give you the FYI. So if I hit inspect here, right, and I look in here, right, that's the heading, but in the table body, right, the TR, the row, Okay, so then in here, in that, we have that button, and that's what's important. That's why that ID actually should render. Now, we're not all the way there yet. I'm just telling you, right? So in this case, you have to go look at, in this case, in the order list, or what we would consider your table renderer from the carbon footprint, how to actually have that show up. Okay, save your code, add an order. Save your code. You don't need to save your code. It's auto-saved, right? But you do have to ultimately commit it, right? And did you see, right? So in this case, did you see the buttons on there? So now we're going to handle the event delegation. Now we're doing the event delegation in 2 steps, right? So we've created the add and delete buttons dynamically with JavaScript because they didn't exist on the page when it was loaded. We can't attach the event listeners directly to them. This is where we're delegating. We're actually adding an event listener on the whole table, right? So that's where if I was to click here, I don't have an event listener outputting, but there is an event. By the way, you could also come over here. I just want to show you this, is that there is a click event listener on here, and that is a way you can actually see if your event listener did get properly done. So in this case, I give you kind of the skeleton of it, right? So, and it tells you here, right? So, and let's read the instructions, right? So, first we just make sure we detect clicks. We're not connecting to the app.js yet. We're just making sure everything's in place here, right? And when you do this on the console, when you click, you should see this as the output, right? So that now here gives you some hints, which by the way, if you didn't, make sure you got that data ID in the HTML. So then commit here, which by the way, if I didn't say, but you know you did need to commit the prior one with adding TBN is actually the button, okay? All right, so now we're actually going to set up those functions in the app.js. Okay, so when we're doing that, now we're going to update wherever we're calling orderless render orders. We actually have to pass them. Now, this is what we were doing in the carbon footprint, right? And so in here, when we call these functions in here, right, and we're going to call them, right, when somebody clicks on those buttons, because remember what happens, you have to write the logic, okay? But first we actually have to set up in here what we need to pass to our order render. So now, once we're done all that, because it's the way I've done this is in stages, so that you should have some working code along the way. Okay, so now in our app.js, setting those functions, but the order.js doesn't know how to catch them, right? We're calling that render order from the order list. We're passing in these function references, but now we actually have to set up. Now this is something that I know I've run into, but setting up and we called it callbacks, something different in the carbon footprint, but it's the same idea where we set up an object on the top of that order list file. And then we're going to pass in. So when you pass in the orders, you're also passing in those callbacks, which by the way, just to be clear, right, here are those callbacks. That's an object. Within that object is the actual key, and then the reference is the function name itself that you wrote above. Okay. All right. So now once you've done that, so just to be clear, and then the rest of your code in there. So now we're going to go back to the event listener we wrote, and then we're going to remove that temporary, console.log, and now we have to write the logic for how to handle if this if we're looking for the class. And this is very similar to what we did in the carbon footprint. If, write an if statement to check if the target has a class of delete button. If it's true, right, call the onDelete and pass it the ID. If write an if statement for the check, right, if the target is, so in this case, and just to be clear here, that on these inspect, right, when you go in and look at them, we adding a class, not because we have a CSS class, which we could, by the way, but in this case we're going to write some logic that says if, right, if the class is edit, then call the edit. If it's delete, call the delete. Again, this is nothing different than what we did, but it's just distilled down, right? Okay, so if you got all the way to the end, here's what it should look like. When you click here, you should get that requesting edit and delete. So what this gives us once you're here is the wiring to then do for next week the actual edit and delete. Because again, the reason I'm doing it this way is to help you focus on the most important things, to understand this event delegation, why we're writing the edit and delete in the app.js, but we're passing them into the order list, which we know as in the past really being in our carbon footprint is our table renderer. Okay, so I'm giving different names, and part of that is to help you understand what that thing is doing, because every time we do a similar thing, but we name it something different, because sometimes you're just memorizing names versus understanding the functionality. So that's part of the goal here, is to distill the functionality, give you different names to hopefully line up and understand what this is doing. Okay, please reach out for help if you need it. I did add one thing, which by the way, I will say here again, I've been doing this, but I'm definitely going to be looking at the commits, okay? Functional code it means, did you get the right output, right? So what we should all be doing is when we're looking at somebody's, and by the way, don't do extra stuff here, right? If you did the clear, that's fine, but don't do the edit and delete here. I will mark off for that. You should go into the console and see if they actually got a unique ID here, right? So submit their form, go in and look if they got that, okay? So what I was saying here is also I added this is what I was talking about, only cover code in the instruction. Extra code will be reduced endpoints, because sometimes what happens is you're just copying everything over trying to make it work versus pulling it apart to understand the pieces, okay? So what I was saying here is the commits, right? So the commits are way important because you have to have those in place to really help you understand, in this case, the goal of this assignment. Okay, reach out for help if you need it.